Oh, I need a can I just use this mic? Can you hear me? Oh, okay, great. Boy, that's really something. Thank you, Andre, so much, and everyone for being here tonight. I had not seen that film. And so that's very interesting, because everything I wrote down to say tonight, I said in that film. So I'm like, okay. But I do have a few other notes, and I'm going to work from them. One, I think is a really important and an amazing thing right now to be in this auditorium in the LBJ complex, to be thinking about how we vote and voters' rights, and some of the legacy that is, whose history is held here in the archive. Because this project actually has a lot to do with how people vote. And so what I wanted to do to introduce tonight's discussion is to kind of trace in my own mind how this project, or how a project comes to be. And something that I hear my husband and also fellow artist Michael Mersil at breakfast and at dinner, and when he's excited about something, say to me that art is not an act of nature, it is an act of culture, it is a social act. And a context needs to be made for it to occur, but also, most importantly, for it to be recognized. And so is this project, with its multiple parts, happened only because of a whole host of people who gathered together and they said yes. And I think the first person who said yes was Andre Bober, who you just heard from, who implicitly understands the need of the art process to be the flexible digits out here, and to become that flexible wrist that connects to the needs of an institution, and to look for and find those places where they can be woven together and they can make something better that neither can maybe make alone. And so, Andre, thank you for your permission and your support and recognition that for me, working with the Dell Medical School would be a dream. A kind of dream come true. But even before our particular project happened, the community first had to say yes. So the community had to imagine itself to use the language to name itself as a wellness city, and to vote for healthcare for everyone, healthcare for all. And at the center of that is the Dell Medical School. So in 2012, many of you, I'm sure, here in this room voted yes to Proposition 1. It was led by Senator Kirk Watson. And is he in the slideshow? Yeah. And he came to be photographed in one of the sessions at the AT&T building, and then he asked us to the Senate. He said, "This is really cool." He said, "You need to come to the Senate." And the man overseeing the security in the Senate kept saying, "What do you do? They don't ever let anyone come do anything like this in the Senate chambers." But the Senate chambers had this beautiful natural light, and we photographed there the tour guides and the tourists and many of the legislative aides and many visitors from outside the country. So the thing that is maybe unheard of today in the atmosphere we're in is that people voted to increase their taxes for the public good. Mm-hmm. And because of that, the first class of students are now in attendance at the center of that project, which is the Dell Medical School. And just like the legislation that makes it possible, that program is rethinking, reimagining everything that has to do with how healthcare is received and how it is delivered, and to thinking about how do we really pay attention to what the experience of every person who needs or receives care, and how does that happen? And that's everything from, like, what are those awful hospital gowns you have to wear? Like, why do they have to be so ugly? To what's the quality of the light, and what does architecture and how do the spaces we design have everything to do with how we feel? And how do we pay attention to how we feel? And so it's almost a miracle that since 2012, when that legislation or when that initiative was passed, that we already have the first building open and functioning, and 2 others very soon on their way to opening. So the other sort of the smaller miracle or amazing thing is that when I was asked to work on this project, I was, I guess for those of you that know public art, you would also know that it's very unusual for a process to be the proposal. Most often a project has a form or it has a location. It's a sculpture in a court, or it's a wall piece or a floor piece. It may be very integrated and made in a very responsive way, but very often it's something that has borders. And the thing about my work is often its borders are not very clear, and its process is not always clearly bracketed. And so, but what I did was propose this process you heard described, photographing through this membrane in over 12 locations in the community. And for Clay Johnson, the visionary dean of the school, and Andre and Landmarks, and the many, many people at the university say, yeah, we could do that. And that there would be something as permanent as the beautiful porcelain enamel baked made by fire panels, as there are the more ephemeral, we don't know where they're going to land, all the books and newspapers, that those 2 things could be accepted as public art is, to me, a small miracle. So you've seen, so the basis of this is trust, and you've seen and heard my description of the process, but what I want to say is that trust, which sets the ground that makes this project possible, started here in these conversations with Clay and Andre, but also back at the studio. I want to thank Jessica Naples-Grilly, who I know you don't want to stand up, but put your hand up, who's been the project manager, and the person whose back you saw with the camera. And Jessica not only quietly and efficiently kept all the 21,000 images organized, administrated, cropped, sequenced, and for 3 very different productions, the 70 enamel panels, the newsprint book, the newspaper. But I also want to say that Jessica makes, in the studio, a generous space to allow the process for that editing and selecting 1 image of everyone, and allowing that process to unfold in time. She makes the trust. Everyone that I work with is part of making that landscape of trust that believes that making matters. So it's across and top down that needs to be present. It makes an atmosphere that's essential to work, that I think is hard to list in any job description. But trust makes a space of responsiveness, which is essential to making work. It makes a condition where I can allow myself to know and to feel what I know, and to know what I feel, and then allow myself to let that knowing and that feeling guide the work. And so Jessica's counterpart is in the equally amazing Nisa Barger. And Nisa, I'm not sure you're here, but she's the joint here between our studio process and the building process and the engineering that was always marrying the many, many steps that really are invisible in the end, and all done with incredible grace and patience. Also at the studio, here from the studio tonight, are Kara Gut, who touched every image, how many times? Raise your hand. Nicole Monahan, who set the project in motion with the initial structure and was part of all of the first residencies. Nicole, thank you. And at a distance, I want to toast Nicole Romy and Claire Ronan from my studio who could not be here, because just as the vote is a we in an us-them world, this project is a big we. We on many levels. Also here tonight, as a total surprise to me, is Steve Van Dyke, who is here from KVO, and they're the ones that have been up all night for weeks finishing all the porcelain panels. So Steve, thank you for coming. And Steve kept saying to me, this is the hardest project we have ever done, ever. I also want to say that the process has been full of what life is full of, which is leaving and arriving. Adam Boley, a beautiful artist of deep and generous heart, and our assistant on all the residencies, died way too young this summer. He is in one of the panels that you'll see in the exhibition tomorrow. And while Adam so incredibly prematurely was leaving us, Willie Barger was born and is now almost one, Nisa's son, and his enthusiasm for life is infectious. And it's that the processes of art and life are always woven. So I'm skipping the part that I said there. So what I want to say maybe to end is that Proposition 1 happened in part because the story could be created and shared to help everyone imagine something different, a new way to create a wellness system, health for everyone. And that story, like art, had to be found and told, and then it had to be received and recognized for the imagination of it to become reality. And language and the crafting of that story and the retelling of that story was crucial to this happening. And so for my project, I wanted to commission the writers, the 7 authors, each with a different hand in their voice, to relate to the themes of resilience, gesture, care, recognition. And so tonight, 4 of the writers are here. 3 are on stage tonight. Brian Rotman is here, actually most recently from London, where maybe the most recent thing was the production of a play there. But he's a mathematician and a semiotician. He's the Emeritus Distinguished Humanities Professor in the Department of Comparative Studies, where I teach at The Ohio State University. And his book, Being Beside Ourselves, about embodied and linguistic knowing, has been, I think, at the heart of some of the questions in my work. And I'm grateful that our back and forth on this essay has made a new friendship. And Natalie Shapiro is here from Tufts, where she is a professor of the practice of poetry. I like the practice part. And Natalie is the first poet, writer, person, also lawyer, that I turned to when I wanted to make my first newspaper for a project in New York at the Armory. And I think the newspaper's been a way of trying to offer up sideways in. Like, how do you get from the side into something without being ever told what to think, but given the language to think for yourself and imagine? And so Natalie wrote for every newspaper I've made, which is only 3, but it will be ongoing, and has a new book out forthcoming from Copper Canyon called Hard Child, which, is that out? Not yet. Okay. And then Kathleen Stewart, more familiarly Katie, who I met for the first time in person just for lunch a day and a half ago, 2 days ago, but whose book, Ordinary Affects, I have many copies of, distributed in different places in the studio and the house. And I thought, that's so interesting that I keep buying this book. And the thing about Katie's writing, which is, I feel such a kinship with, is how it's about paying attention to the things that are there, but not necessarily present to our attention or our experience, and to find a way to write to that. I'm so glad we've had this chance. I didn't know she was here. And then when I found out that Katie was here, it's like, of course. And then finally, I'd like to thank Polly Strong, who's going to moderate tonight, who's a professor of anthropology and the director of the Humanities Institute, where we had a wonderful conversation this afternoon. Actually, Polly's image is the end image on the row of panels that are now installed at the learning building. And so you can see that. And when everyone else was saying, I don't really like my image, Polly raised her hand and said, I like mine. And I felt so much better. And so finally, before we gather together and I hand this over to Katie, who's going to start, I just want to say that we make work to be in conversation. And conversation is what amplifies the work. It's what makes the work alive. And I'm really grateful for all of you for being here. Thank you.
Wow, it's bright up here. When I first saw these images of Anne's, I thought that they made me think about thinking. What thinking is in these photographs and what thinking can be. And then also they made me think about the need to build muscles for living. I wrote something called What Comes Through. These images make a still life of the clothed body. A body part touches a membrane. A cheekbone comes through fully freckled. The hands, buttoning or unbuttoning a lab coat, look older, as if they have lived a different life. One physicality thrusts forward into focus. Another hangs back in an amorphous atmosphere. A head looks too big. A face looks like a paper doll cutout. As in a primitivist painting, the composition builds on one object and then another, each one discrete and bounded. What comes through is a fabulous, woodenly dream of life captured in an instant. The body becomes a scene of elements in proximity, like the painting of a village in the snow with a barn and skaters on a pond and trucks loaded with logs and running dogs and ducks and winter clothes. Things are loaded with significance, but cut free of the heavy hand of explanation and the dead ground of knowing. What comes through is a gift of specificity, weighted with precision. What's in a fingertip, a flower, a freckle? Hair cascades down a woman's back, every strand thick and straight or white and curled. Not alone, body parts are wrapped and accompanied. The hands carry a harmonica. They wear nails, a tattoo. Wrists show the tender subtlety of a vein under the skin. A delicate bone protrudes just slightly. Necks and shoulders are wrapped in necklaces, dog tags, scarves, and shawls. There is a blood pressure cuff, an eye patch, keys worn around the neck on a cord, a hospital wristband, the frill on the front of a blouse, a sharp pink tie setting off a dark suit, and a white shirt. The slowness of attention these photos perform is a pause poised between touch and a speculative wondering. In its world, hands hesitate and drop back, or they venture out like emissaries. The ephemerality of touch is frightening or sad, but also comforting. There is just the reaching to a membrane that separates and connects. Reactions ring out like the chorus of a song. Here we are. This is it. The eyes are a little wide. The soft background sharpens the poke of the finger. There is a dimple. An eyebrow raises. An elbow turns. This is it, now. And with it, a backlog of pasts and the oh so modest suggestion of a future.
When I was photographed for this project, I found that I passed into and through the intimacy of that experience, and I was shocked. And I mean shocked, like I was surprised because I came into it unprepared for how close I would end up feeling with the other people who are in these photographs, but also shocked as in sort of jolted in a physical way and confronted with a very real sort of energy. I was pressing the imprint of my body into this material, knowing that so many people had also done the exact same thing with the same material, and it ultimately both released us back into the world and also continued to hold us each in its own way. I remembered a line from Hemingway that I had read a long time ago that's in the newspaper. The quote is, "I felt my soul or something coming right out of my body, like how you'd pull a silk handkerchief out of a pocket by one corner." And all of our bodies pressing the material in sequence like that, it reminded me of this idea of the soul as something tactile, something that touches the body and moves with and against it, and enables a connection between the physical forms that make us humans and some other external force that makes us human and that connects us all to each other. And so I started to think about the ways in which people historically and today have presented our bodies and imprints of our bodies as markers of ourselves, as evidence of existence, identity, and value, and as ways of both demonstrating our uniqueness and our universality as people. So I started to do a reading for the piece that I wrote in the newspaper about prehistoric handprints in caves, methods of people identifying and expressing themselves by pressing themselves into something tangible and leaving a record of that pressure. I've thought about palm reading and the practice of touching someone's hand and extrapolating from the topography of the body, the specific nature of the person within. And I thought about sound, like records, which rely, sort of on the reading of a set of grooves. Inside every body is a person, full and whole, and the difference between remembering that inside every body is a person, and forgetting it, is the difference between a world in which we see each other fully and care for each other fully, and a world that's given over to negation and subjugation. And I'm so deeply grateful to this project for being a representative of and a champion for that first world with such intense presence. So I'm just going to read a very brief excerpt from the essay in the newspaper. The conventional terms for the architectural features of a fingerprint: arches, loops, and whorls. The word whorl may also be used to denote the pulley of a spindle or the spiral of a shell, the wheel from which emerges the silken body. It derives from whirl, the action of circumvolution, the language of the pitching, heaving sea, the language of the interior rush and pulsing of the body. To quote Thoreau from Walden, "Many an irksome noise go a long way off, is heard as music." The record spins on the turntable, making of itself a whirl. On the A side, classical music intended to be played during pregnancy to herald the outside world to come. And on the B side, to be played to the infant after she is born, the sound of a heart as heard from the inside of the body, so that the child, amid so much utter newness, might have something to recognize. A single sound on loops, its wavelengths cutting the air in whirls and arches.
I first encountered Anne Hamilton's work when I arrived in Ohio State University in the late 90s. And the piece was Anne burning letters, alphabetic letters, from a text with obsessive zeal, and then making them again with her finger in some sort of solution. I thought it was demonic. And I loved it. What particularly attracted me was the combination of text and the body. I'd, for some years, too many perhaps, had been interested in the relationship between mathematical symbols and these sort of invisible, impalpable objects that we think of as mathematical, whether they're numbers, functions, topological space, and so on. They have no instantiation, no physical presence. And yet, millions of people over the centuries have been able to think about them in what seems to be a reasonably consistent and continuous way. I was fascinated by this, and to some extent I still am. The relationship between mathematical symbols and their invisible reference found its sort of place in writing about zero, which is a sensational symbol in its own right, culturally and mathematically, and its sort of evil twin, infinity. By this time, I was sort of, having done that work, I was interested in extending it to not mathematical symbols, but the symbols that we use to write a speech, alphabetic, in our case, in the West, and so on, alphabetic symbols, alphabetic script. So that seeing Anne erasing these, in fact, and then making them again, it sort of fell on very fertile ground. And since then, I've written about that connection in its own way, and I don't want to go on about it. Why did Anne ask me to write something for the newspaper? Certainly I hadn't collaborated with her before, I'd just been a fan. And I still am. I'm enormously admiring of many of the things she's done and is doing. So when she asked me, would I be interested in writing a piece about this installation, some of which I'd seen in her studio and been intrigued by and somewhat mystified about why I was intrigued. They snagged me in some way that I couldn't recognize immediately, or at least for some time, until I started to write about them. And what I thought about them was that they did something magical. What they did in visual terms was to offer a gesture of touch. And I wondered how on earth they did that. How you could use visual language to cross over to something that was tactile, something that was offering that was tactile. I wrote a piece called Viewing, in quote marks, the touch. No, I don't think that was the right title, actually, but never mind. The viewing, in quote marks, was the point. How did this happen? How did she manage to do this? And what was the way of speaking about it? She said to me, look, I don't want you to write a review or an exhibition, an exhibition catalogue entry or anything like that. So think about gesture, think about care, think about touch, think about recognition. And she listed these things and so on that I should think about. Well, I didn't really take her advice, and I wrote something that came out as a review. And she said, no, I don't want that. Go back, as it were. And since she was commissioning it, I couldn't really argue. So I went back, and draft 3, I think, she said, you've nailed it. Oh, thank God for that. Well, as I say, the mystery that intrigued me was how she did it. Being a mathematician in a previous life, you always think of things in terms of problems. You sort of focus on the problem, and you think about nothing else in a sort of rather one-dimensional way until you feel you've understood it. It's a horrible profession in that way, but that's how you have to operate. And they got me early, and that's how I operate. I thought, well, okay, what's going on there is that these individuals, these subjects, are touching a membrane. Yes, that's true, that's the given. And the membrane is invisible in the images, which is the most crucial and important part. So that you get people, subjects, touching or having parts of their bodies, body parts, touching the screen, you can't see the screen, and you're left with the recognition that something is missing. Because touch, above all other things, above all other gestures, and the deepest form of gesture, is two-sided. It's intimate. You can't touch without being touched. And that's not true of any of the other senses, as Aristotle was interested to observe. Well, if you can't touch without being touched, these images present this difficulty. You can't parse them, you can't respond to them wholly visually, because the touch-y is missing. You just get the touch, that's it. But what is being touched, one doesn't know. And my solution to this, whether it's acceptable, whether in fact it works, and so on and so forth, is that we, the viewer, had to fill in the role of touchy. And in filling it in, obviously not literally, we were being offered a touch. We were offered the promise of a touch. And that seemed to me sort of what was going on. And that seemed to fit in some way what intrigued me, what snagged me about the images. And that's what I wrote. And you can read it and ignore it if you like, as is the case in these things. But I want to sort of finish by saying that, in fact, the work that we all see all the time and so on was commissioned by a medical establishment. And it's interesting what, as it were, satisfied or pleased or was on their itinerary, that they fell in love with these images enough to sponsor the whole large apparatus of the installation. Two things that come to mind. One of them, of course, is that each image isolates a body part. And that is what our universal experience is of going to, certainly, Western medicine. We never go and present ourselves as a person or as a whole body. We go and present whatever bit of us is wrong with us. And we go to a professor of bits You know, I mean, who specializes in the bit that we present, whether it's an elbow or whether it's our heart or liver or whatever. So what these images do, of course, is, as it were, do to us what happens to us when we present in a medical establishment, hoping that the bit will be cared for, cured, looked at, examined, and made the object of attention. Exactly what happens here, of course. The other aspect that is interesting in relation to their sort of medical placement is the process by which these images were formed. What happens, and I'm sure you've seen it all now, you go behind a screen. The membrane is this sort of technological object that makes these things possible. You go behind the screen, you cannot see through the screen. The other side of the screen is Anne. She's talking to you. You say, no, move that, no, turn around, no. And you're completely will-less, actually, at the mercy of this sort of voice. It's saying, no, that's good, hold it. And then the camera's clicking away. It must be, I don't know how many, 20, 30 images are taken of you. You don't know how long it's going to last. And then that's it. While you're there, you just have this disembodied voice. It's not harsh and it's not aggressive and it's rather caregiving in all sorts of ways, but it is disembodied. And you can't see it. You can't see her. And you're just left in a sort of rather odd position in a cubicle, waiting for this to be finished. And it's not unpleasant, but it's odd. It's out of time. And you just relax into yourself, as it were. And what happens is that many of the expressions, in fact, I think most of them, if not all, have a certain pensiveness, an innerness to them, which results from this isolation in this box, actually. But it's very good in terms of the result. Well, of course, that happens exactly when you go to a medical establishment. They put you in a box, they close the curtain, they give you a back to front gown, which you can never do up properly, and then you wait. Well, so those are two sort of, I think, aspects of the images which must have delighted the medical people. Now, I have an antipathy to reading out stuff that I've read, so I won't. But what I will do, and I was given permission this afternoon by the sort of bosses of this afternoon's episode, that I could read it out. So if you wouldn't mind, I'll do that. Well, even if you do, actually. It's a medical scene from a novel by a man called Ben Lerner, who is an accomplished poet and has written a brilliant book called something like Why I Hate Poetry. And of course he doesn't, but it is a brilliant sort of opening of that sort of sentiment. And this is from his second novel called 1004, 10:04. And the protagonist author has just been, he's waiting for his CAT scan, his MRI, whatever. And he's come to see the specialist, who's Dr. Walsh. And he said, and I'll read it. Finally, he got in to see Dr. Walsh, famous in his field. Silver hair, rimless glasses, a purple tie under the white coat, always smiling. At least the corners of his mouth were slightly upturned, because his blue eyes were narrowed in a perpetual squint, enabling him to express a kind of optimistic concentration without seeming patronizingly upbeat. When Dr. Walsh told him the findings, the author was looking at a print of paintings of a beach scene, 2 empty white wooden chairs facing the sea, a small sailboat in the middle distance. Who chooses this art? The author wanted to ask. The art? Dr. Walsh would further narrow his eyes. Do you choose this stuff, or does the hospital buy it in bulk? Where's it come from? Dr. Walsh would swivel in his chair to see the image the author was staring at, then turn back to the author, but not speak. Look, I understand the desire to have some sort of decorations that indicate that this isn't just a hospital room, that a patient isn't just a pathological body, that this isn't purely the realm of science. I understand that the exclusive criterion you or the institution would have for selecting an appropriate image would be that it's inoffensive, if not actively calming, at least not agitating. It's supposed to prove that you are neither a machine or an eccentric because it nods blandly to established cultural modes, the medium of painting, and the cliched instance of it. They're images of art, not art. 3 doctors at the hospital share this consultation room. Dr. Walsh might respond, adjusting his wedding band. But look, one of the problems, cold spreading through him as when they'd injected him with the contrast dye. One of the problems is that these images of art only address the sick, the patients. It would be absurd to imagine a doctor lingering over one of these images between appointments, being interested in it or somehow attached to it, having his day inflected by it or whatever. Apart from their depressing flatness, their interchangeability, what I'm saying is we can't look at them together. They help establish, deepen the gulf between us because they address only the sick, face only the diagnosed. Instead, I said none of this, a tremor in the author's voice. Am I going to be okay? That's this. Nothing could be further from the experience that the author describes than produced by Anne Hamilton's images. Thank you. Are we on again?
We're on.
All right.
Okay. Ready? Okay, I think I'm here. Okay, I'm here. I'm here. And then
Oh, what's
in order.
bottle? Where are we sitting?
Oh, okay.
Where? There?
You were supposed to sit.
That was great. Yeah.
These lights are very bright, shining on us. So we're going to pretend that we're in a very intimate environment, having a conversation about these very intimate photographs, which are also larger than life. So we are in a larger than life space, talking about these intimate photographs with people. Some of the people are in these photographs, but we have now all experienced them in this particular form. And what's really remarkable about this project, One Everyone, there's many things that are remarkable, but one thing is the modalities in which it appears. Mm-hmm. And this is a modality as well. Mm-hmm. Seeing these in this way is very different from seeing the porcelain plates in the Dell Medical School, which is different from seeing them in the phone book and different from seeing them in the newspaper. And so we have so many different ways of approaching these images that Anne has made possible to us. So I just wanted to start, there are so many words that you have all used to describe these images. But one that I think we might want to talk about a little more is empathy. And I could start with Anne. In what ways do you see these images as related to empathy?
Well, I don't know about the description of being back there as a box, being trapped in a box, and whether you would feel empathetic with that. But I think, as we worked in the studio to scale the image and think about the scale of one of the forms being larger than life size. One of the things we talked a lot about is that when it's a little larger than life size, there's a felt I would say a physical empathy, like that even though they're not your scale, you feel your own physical presence in relationship to them. Like it's a physical empathy that I think is very immediate. And I think about the way our bodies know what to do with a book. Like books really work for the way we work. And so then we know how to touch them, we know how to look through them. This one with newsprint falls open, it kind of has the weight, it has a bodily quality. So while it doesn't represent a body, it has symmetry like we do. It has a front and a back and a right and a left, and that all of those things are maybe not things we would say, oh, that's bodily, but our bodies know how to respond to them. So there's that bodily response. And then I think as we edited the images, I think many of the conversations Jessica and I would have were like, we just say, oh, I feel that. That there was something in this moment that wasn't necessarily the thing presented, but the thing focused on, and that, I don't have a very good vocabulary for like, how do we talk about what's felt and the intelligence of that? But to me, it's that I can feel that too, right? So that if language, if it's almost, you can describe your pain to me, or you can describe your pain to a doctor, and they can know intellectually what you're describing, but they cannot feel what you're feeling. And so, I think in my work, in many ways, I've been very influenced by early on reading Elaine Scarry's book, The Body and Pain, The Making and Unmaking of the World, and thinking about that the task of culture is to close that gap and close that distance. That's empathy. Yeah.
Thank you. I was wondering if, Natalie, when you talked about feeling akin to the other people in these images, if that has something to do with empathy or perhaps with recognition, which is another term that Anne uses a lot in talking about these images.
Yeah, having gone through the process, there's a very basic thing where when I see these photos and I say, oh, I know, this is a stranger who I've had no contact with, but I know that they had this exact same experience as me. And that's the work that we try to do on some level all the time, I think, when we try to just operate as good citizens of the world and not close out people who are not in our immediate orbit. But I also think that there's a posture of vulnerability about the photos that's compounded by, their medical dress and technology in some of them. And even the ones that don't have that, it's just a vulnerable thing to do, to show yourself on to a camera on a giant screen. And seeing people open themselves up to allowing themselves to be seen, I think it invites that trust that you're talking about. It shows that that trust is possible, that it's possible to put it out there and be seen and be recognized.
I've also, relative to that feeling, that empathy, I've wondered, we were in very different circumstances, but as we've been working on this, we've flown in and out of Austin several times, and whenever we're back in the airport, we're like, well, I wonder what would happen if we did this in the airport, or we did it in the bus station, or we did it in places where people from all different places are moving. But I think part of the trust came, or the willingness to participate, is because we would always say, this is part of the Dell Medical School. And so we had oh, okay, like it had a purpose, or it had a function. And I think that gave us license. This strays from the, maybe your question, but it was also partly, there's this question of how do people recognize the project? Recognize or have a way to think about it that they would be willing to, enter the process.
Ryan, I think you want to.
Well, I'm agreeing with Natalie that seeing people in a certain states of privacy and unprotectedness and the innerness that was being captured made them vulnerable and made me feel, looking at the images, in much the same way that I feel about people who are very shy. I immediately sort of feel protective or feel that they need some sort of care, some sort of affection for me. But leaving that aside, I mean, I think that's what was well said, was that when I was writing the piece, I was writing from the point of view of gesture. That's how I saw, that's what the images were doing. They were offering a gesture, they were making a gesture, and so on. And I thought about empathy. And one of the things about empathy is that we think about it differently since the discovery of mirror neurons, that human beings have mirror neurons. I mean, originally it was macaque monkeys, and an extraordinary sort of imitative behavior that these macaque monkeys, they were wired up for neurological investigations. The lab assistant came into the room and picked up a banana that had dropped on the floor or something. And one of the monkeys did exactly the same thing. Copied this image, and this sort of image that the monkey was having of this lab assistant. And it was thought to be something wrong with this sort of, they were wired up, the apparatus, and they checked the apparatus, and they discovered, the people doing these investigations, that in fact the macaque monkeys were copying a gesture that they could do. And that led to the work, well, this was in the late 90s, 97, I think. It led to the whole theory that human beings indeed have mirror neurons, and that this was the basis of human empathy. That, in fact, not only did you, when you saw a gesture that you could make, not only did you actually, were you propelled to mimic it, but even when you didn't mimic it, the neurological apparatus, in fact, produced the beginnings of the movement, but then blocked it. So in other words, it's similar when you see people yawn, you want to yawn. Well, that's explained by. So I thought of this thing in these kind of rather, well, I don't know, sort of scientific terms, really, and just mentioned it in passing that this mimicry was seen to be operating there, but it was more than mimicry, because you were called upon not only to, as it were, acknowledge the gesture of touching, but you were called upon to respond to it, to be the other half of the gesture. So I thought that was my thing about empathy, and I think that it's right what's said, that there is this vulnerability that comes over, and one responds to it. Right?
Katie, you talked about the response as being one of attentiveness, that slowing down.
Yeah, I'm thinking about empathy too now that you've raised that, and thinking that the kind of thing that Brian's describing as vulnerability is a kind of energetic, physical attention that happens all the time. But the photographs slow that down and make it an object of attention. And so I was really interested in the dynamic between those kinds of registers. So just walking into our building here at UT, I often will see something that is just kind of a weird body part, because I think these are weird images. Something is sticking out. And there is a vulnerability in that, and that's a really interesting conundrum of issues there. Something is just happening almost by accident. Anne is staging it. She's telling people, put your cheek up there. And then you get a really weird image that I think happens to us all the time, and that we don't slow down to see because we're doing other things, but that it still impacts us, that we're constantly, and that maybe that's a way to think about what vulnerability is too. The vulnerability of being together, passing each other, encountering each other, being in public together, and all kinds of issues arise with that, including the unbearableness of that. I was talking to a doctor just before we began this event he was talking about these encounters with his patients who have very difficult lives, to say the least. And what do you do with that? And it's such an accumulation and such an amassing of these kinds of experiences that when I see them, these images, it's a relief because it's a kind of a release. It's, okay, now I can take a little moment to experience these things that I'm actually experiencing all the time, every day, but I don't know what the word is here. It's not really, for me, about what's happening inside me and my empathy for some person over there. It's much more direct impact of these body parts sticking out and these other kinds of events that are constantly happening that are kind of coming at me from a side angle and are not assimilated into any kind of rhetoric that we have or even into experience, and yet constitute us and the way we live and what experience is.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's like all those, it's almost like you're talking about everything that we almost train ourselves to ignore in some ways, like to ignore seeing or feeling something. Like this is much maybe more simple, but today in the humanities conversation, this thing come up about glance, and to me, I've been thinking about glance in relationship to the gesture of the hand in here. And that when you're walking down the street, all the way we adjust ourselves to move as a group and to acknowledge but not acknowledge each other. And then when you decide to break that and you decide, I'm going to actually make some sort of eye contact, or I'm going to make contact. And however brief that is, that it changes then everything that happens afterwards. But you have to allow that to happen first. And I think there's that quality that happens like in a moment that I do think is extended here for me. Yeah.
Right. And Brian talked about these as being the opposite of what you often see in hospitals, the kind of trite art that is intended to not provoke. And I'm wondering what, as you were creating this project, you were thinking might be the impact of these images on medical students who will see these in their learning center every day, their instructors, their clinical professors, patients who will see these images in the research building.
I didn't think about that. I really didn't. That's a really interesting question, Polly, because I think my concern is for what it is and how it is what it is. And then I don't think about, or I don't worry about, like, do you get it? Or is it doing something? Or is it performing? Because I'm just trying to have it be what it is. And then I'm trusting that will be received. There will be the touchy, as Brian says. And so, I mean, that's going to sound terrible, isn't it? Like I didn't think about them. But it's because I don't think about it in that way. Okay, but I mean, there were a lot of conversations before the project really had the form that it's taken, where I worked with Dial and Partners, and we had meetings, and we were thinking about how could these images be part of the sign system or the wayfinding system. So you would say, well, by the white elbow, or by the blue jacket with the pencil, or that a gesture would be the thing that addressed you rather than a number on a door. And for all sorts of reasons that kind of didn't work, or it wasn't really practical. But I have thought about, and we're in conversations about, how do these images in the image library kind of potentially, do they get distributed through the complex so that there's this recurrence of the work or the kind of images that makes that environment. And when I look at them, I think they're kind of like breathing out. Like, I do think that there's something very slow about them, and that maybe that's that, I don't know, privacy or inwardness or a sense of reflection. I don't let anyone smile, and I'm like, no smiling. And because smiling is something we do for the camera. And maybe that has something, but I think that we're not totally done with how these images may have a life. Yeah.
I asked that question because I've been having meetings with first-year medical students who are interested in the medical humanities. They're interested in retaining their humanness. That's how they speak about it as they go about their medical education. And it feels to me that these are profoundly humane and caring images that could well be used in that way. Even if that wasn't your intention, I can quite imagine it'll be the effect.
I think that everyone looks beautiful and everyone looks dignified. And that was really important to me, because that's what you want in that interaction. So it's demonstrative. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you said that, Anne, because when I first started writing about the images and so on, I think I either said to you or prevented myself from saying to you that you'd written the perfect visual mission statement for a medical center. And I thought, well, that was insulting. I mean, it's treating you like some sort of advertising person. And it wasn't the proper response to a work of art. But now you've said that, I just am even more puzzled as to, I mean, I'm sure they do humanize if that's what the medical students need to happen to them. I'm sure they do that, and they're moving in their own way. But that you didn't in any way have the sort of intention of they're being placed in a medical environment. It's amazing. I'm not contradicting. I'm sure you're right.
I mean, I thought about them as being demonstrative. I don't know what the other word is, and I certainly thought about the context a lot, but it wasn't that I thought they would do something. It didn't. I wasn't ascribing that to them. It's that they would.
But they do fit well.
I hope so.
I know you're disclaiming any part in the fact that they fit well, but they do.
No, it's all responsive, but it's I'm getting in a circle here.
Well, I
Natalie.
wonder if one kind of component of their presence might be that they show the body in a sort of utilitarian way, which is, I can't speak very much to what art is ordinarily in doctors' offices, but when I think, I think of seeing a lot of diagrams, right? This is what it looks like inside of your body right now, and this being a way of showing the body that that it has a wholeness to it, and it has another life outside of being looked into and taken apart also. Well,
there's something too about that you really see very little of the body. So it's almost like by being less there is more there. And I think that's really important to what they are. And I think that that speaks also to intuition. I think about one of my favorite things to read in the New York Times Magazine is the diagnosis. Someone comes in with symptoms of something, and then what the process is of figuring out what's wrong, what this cough might mean, something that can be related to so many possible ailments. and how much intuition and listening and paying attention to information that's not obvious is also a part of a doctor, nurse's, caregiver's craft, you know, and the practice of that. And that touch or just a feeling is so much information that has everything to do with their ability to respond. So I think that's in this in some way. It's like, how do you trust that that is something? You know, it's how do we trust, because we're so information, and so, you know, anyone in medicine has to know so many different things, because you so often have to cross from over here to over here, and, you know, between disconnected pieces of information. And I think that's why I wanted all of you to write. You know, like, I think that also that really respecting this associative intelligence is also part of the project. Yeah.
Speaking of associated intelligence, I know there's questions in the audience. There's 2 microphones on the floor, and if you would just come up to the microphone, and please keep your questions brief so we can hear from a number of people.
Polly, I apologize. It may not be as brief as you'd like, but I never am. I've got about 140, mostly freshmen, in a course on the doctor-patient relationship here, and we're working with the Humanities Institute. And while I do appreciate that from an artist's perspective, the making is very important, whether the artist is visual or a writer, I keep telling these students, many of whom will someday be first-year medical students, that immersing themselves in the humanities and not losing touch with the humanities will make them better doctors and better healers. And it's not exactly the same thing. I wish you 5 could speak to my students for a moment and explain to them how appreciating your work, how looking through the phone book, the newspaper, going to the actual installation will help them as pre-healthcare professional students and eventually as healthcare professional students and then healthcare professionals.
I'm really glad you're here. You know, I think that I don't know how, like, specifically to respond in the sense that, you know, if you look, this will happen or this will accrue in you. But I want to kind of go back to something I said in the very beginning about letting yourself feel the thing you think or feel the thing you know. That I feel like we have a very small vocabulary to address that, and that in any practice, and the most intimate is of any practice over a lifetime might perhaps be medicine, is that you need all of your humanity to stand with and to offer a kind of fraternity to your patients. And that recognition is something you have to also be able to first give yourself before you can actually share that with your patients. And so that isn't necessarily something that you can study in, you know, the incredible technical, biological, medical material you have to get through to become a doctor. But I would say that it's hand in hand with the practice. Does that resonate with any of the students that are here in your first year? How do you allow yourself? How do you trust yourself? How do you have to do for yourself that very thing that you can then offer to your patients?
Does anybody else want to address that?
Well, it seems to me the context, though, in which the question is asked, I mean, I don't know about this university, but I imagine that most of the American universities and increasingly English universities they're stuck on a kind of pragmatic STEM voyage where the humanities get increasingly less valuable, respect, faculty, funds and so on, which is a much larger thing to do with the corporatization of universities. And what we could offer in relation to that combine harvester going through the humanities, I don't know. I mean, the problem should be addressed to the president, to the people who guide the curricula, the deans who give money to STEM because that's what the local legislators value. And humanities, what do you do with humanities? Well, not much. I mean, really, it's like art, isn't it? So I don't think that I mean, it's a large-scale problem of not just for medical students, although it's serious for medical students because they're dealing with people in interpersonal terms, whereas perhaps computer engineers don't. But it's a problem, and it's a large-scale problem, and I don't
On the level of the tiny little experiment that this is, it's kind of interesting to think about. When you talk about what are the practices of doctors' lives, I think they're overwhelmed by a lot of stuff that's going on. So you would have to have a completely saturated environment that allowed whatever it is these are doing. And there are things that they're doing and that you can't just teach them. You can't just teach people. Now you got to think differently about patients. You have to change the entire experience of being a doctor with patients, which is obviously not going to happen. But this little experiment of people having to pass through these images in the medical center, I think is really interesting to think about the ways in which that can have effects on doctors and doctors-to-be, in the way that I discovered that my teaching became much better one time when I accidentally had a large lecture class right after a yoga class. And I always fall asleep at the end of yoga because I want to. And so I would pass out, and then I would stand up, and somebody would have to wake me up. And I would walk to my class, and it was a completely different experience because I just look around the room, for being spacey for a minute, and I would be in the room. And that taught me, that little experiment, accidental experiment, a lot of things about contact and affect in a classroom that now is very simple and easy for me, and I don't understand why it's not simple and easy but for other people and doesn't become just a very simple thing that doesn't require anything except these kinds of little weird accidental things, experiments that happen that can make a big difference.
Is that you, Ted?
Can I just add one thing,
yes,
Ted,
go
before
for
you
it.
ask your question? I just want to add one thing. I think that the other thing is that about vulnerability is that when I think the very first sort of piece I did when I was in graduate school that kind of changed the whole course of my life in art was I stood wearing a toothpick suit. I mean, it was a suit covered in toothpicks, so I was like a porcupine, like full of defensive sort of surface. And I just stood there, and I allowed myself to just be seen. And in the act of actually kind of being very vulnerable, I feel like there was this incredible strength that I got that gave me trust and confidence to do other kinds of things. And I know it's something like in my own teaching, I talk a lot about the students. It's like until you can be vulnerable, until you can fail miserably, you actually, can't do anything. And so I think there's something about in the doctor-patient exchange that it's about also being able to, people in front of you are very vulnerable, and you have to also allow your own vulnerability in the room with that. So, okay, Ted.
Well, thank you. These are amazing and really captivating works of art, so thank you. They're amazing. And I get what everyone's saying about touch, and they do feel and seem tactile to me, and they are touching, as it were. But the thing that gets me personally with your art is it is sort of creepy, and I just, who are these people? I want to know what their stories are. It's like a Rorschach test to me, almost. And I'm finding myself projecting what I think these guys' stories are. I'm just dying to know who these people are. And I guess because there's a semiotician on stage and an artist, it kind of got me thinking, these are just 500 semi-random people in a town of hundreds of thousands. The work is captivating, but it's sort of got me thinking, how important is the subject versus what I'm projecting onto this subject and is sort of unanswerable, or maybe in the semiotician's words, how important is the signifier versus the symbol? And I guess as the artist, were the subjects themselves important and they play a role in the creation of your art, or could it have been anyone, and would this have been the product, if that makes sense?
It could be everyone. I mean, yes, I mean, it could be literally everyone. I could keep doing this. I could stay in Austin forever. And so every person is particular, and I think in every person, in fact, chooses to be part of this process. So everyone, I mean, maybe Andre really requested some people to come, but it was, completely a volunteer. So I didn't go out and select like people, but we did really think about wanting to be in very different places. And I think, if we'd done a fourth residency, I can think of other kind of social institutions I would have liked to have set up where you're going to be crossing with different parts of the community. So, I mean, you're right. In many ways, it's arbitrary, but each contact is specific. Yeah. So.
This is not a question, it's a compliment. I think what you've described really nails it, because you're talking about a form of art that really allows the viewer to be a participant observer and actually have an altered state of consciousness kind of experience. And actually, the best doctors have a way of doing that when they have encounters with patients. So, you said, well, I hadn't thought about that, but you nailed it.
Thank you.
Anne, thank you so much for being with us.
Are we finished?
Katie, Natalie, Brian, this has been a very interesting conversation, and the dignity of these images are such a source of optimism for the future at a time when we really need it. Thank you very much.
I want to say one more
Yes.
thing.
I was going to say one more.
Okay, maybe everybody wants to say one more
I
thing.
just want to say.
Oh, and I say, are you wanting to ask a question?
Someone's going to, oh.
So why don't you say one more thing, and we'll take one more question.
Okay. I just want to tell the story. There was a very short exchange that I had with the dean, with Clay Johnson, and about beauty. And I said that I was writing to him an email. I can't even believe he had time to email me back. And I said, I think everybody looks very beautiful, and that's important to me. And he said that there are neurological studies that have looked at when we see something beautiful, that part of us that is neurologically stimulated is everything that's related to the sense of touch. So we are literally touched when we see something beautiful. And I'm holding on to that one. Yeah.
It was the previous question I wanted it seems to me perfectly natural to worry about the biographies of the people who are imaged in some way, obviously. But I think that the installation as a whole asked you to do the opposite. It asked you, in fact, to lose the individuality of the subjects in the name of some larger thing that was going on. I mean, in other words, I don't think they were portraits of individuals. They were they were models, modeled by Anne to do certain things and so on. And one wouldn't actually, perhaps, one wouldn't worry or be curious about the biography of a model in a say a classical painting of the muse of history or whatever and so on. One wouldn't actually, because she's there to represent something else. And I think that all these individuals, they are individuals, obviously, and they're manifestly interesting as individuals. But I think the whole installation, when you see them en masse, is that the individuals disappear, the individualities disappear, and what they have in common, which is the gesture of touch, it comes out very strongly. So that's all I wanted to say about that. Okay.
Please.
Is this on? There we
Yes.
go. So I was photographed by you a number of years ago for this project, and seeing it now in this new context, which previously was just in New York, the medicalization of it is really interesting. And I don't want this to sound less than optimistic, but I'm curious how you reconcile that touch is also, like you're saying, a very vulnerable thing, and in a medical context, touch is often how illness gets passed. And one of the things I was thinking about looking at the screen is I remembered that when I was photographed, how many of us were touching it, but it wasn't getting cleaned. And I'm definitely not a hypochondriac, and so that wasn't a concern for me. But thinking about this work now in the context of a medical school, I wonder, how do you
like
reconcile?
fear of contamination. And,
And especially, I mean, maybe there are larger metaphorical ramifications given the political state currently, but how do you reconcile that vulnerability is a powerful connector, but also our most dangerous
a
by
potential
definition?
contaminant.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting, you know, like, it's like now, so you go and it's like, you're the dentist and like, you know, they're protected from you, right? Purple gloves and all of that. And we long for, direct contact, and we think about Ebola and, you know, public health and all of that. You know, I think touch is so fundamental to being sentient beings, so it isn't that I can reconcile that contradiction, really. But I do remember that we started really vigilantly cleaning with alcohol wipes. And that was actually, there was on the shoot, there was a person who, that was their role, keep the alcohol on the surface. But yeah, I mean, it's like today I brought up, it was the quote of Anne Carson, who in one of her books writes about, you know, that contact is crisis. And it's always, you know, both. And I think that's why I'm interested in it. Yeah. So how we touch is really important. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
And how we see is really important. And one of the lessons that I learned as a designer was that sometimes I could see better when I would squint my eyes and look through my eyelashes.
Yeah, like when there's less.
Is what these images do.
So this comment was that how we see is also really important, and that these images transform how we see.
That's right.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much.